So, with this part, I'm going to start off with a bit of a story from my high school days. So, in high school, I took AP English my senior year. We had about 25 students in the class, and towards the end of the semester, we were split into five different groups of five, about roughly. And each group was assigned a specific book to read, and then every student in that group had to read the book and then write an argumentative research paper based on that group's reading. And once our papers were finished, our assignment was not done. We then had to read every other group's book, as well as each student's research paper. Then, in our groups of five, we spent an hour and 40 minutes in the front of the class defending our work from questions and challenges from our classmates. Now, all five of these books dealt with colonialism. I was assigned Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart, which is a novel about colonialism from the African perspective. The curriculum was designed to open our eyes to the horrors of colonialism and drive home the message that it was a destructive force in the world. So rather than going along with that narrative that we were supposed to absorb, I took a different approach. I didn't see the book as wholly anti colonialist or anti Western. Instead, I saw a lot more nuance in the novel. I argued that Achebe's view of colonialism was complex, that he saw some good as well as bad come out of the colonial era. Now, when we were at the front of the class, my paper was ripped apart by my peers. How could Achebe, a Nigerian novelist writing about colonialism, possibly see anything positive in it? I fielded this question over and over again from my classmates, and my answer was always the same, that I'm not saying he thinks it was a total good, but he recognizes that there was some aspects of pre-colonial African culture that were deeply problematic. And my main evidence was Achebe's repeated mention of a practice in this African tribe he was writing about, where they would abandon newborn twins in the woods to die. My point was fairly simple. If Achebe wanted us to believe that colonialism was entirely bad, why include examples of the tribe's cruel practices? Now, I ended up getting the worst grade in the class, and although my paper was heavily criticized by my peers, nearly everyone was surprised to learn that I scored the lowest. Remember, we had all read everybody else's research paper, and some were objectively clearly weaker. And so I believe that I got the worst grade, not because of my paper necessarily, but because I went against the lesson that we were supposed to learn, and the teacher didn't agree with what I was arguing. So nearly a decade later, just last week, I was reading Douglas Murray's book, The War on the West. In his chapter on history, Murray discusses how Western intellectuals see the West as fundamentally bad and colonialism as a great horror with nothing redeeming about it. Then he contrasts that with the view of non-Westerners, and he uses Chinua Achebe as his example. I have a quote here. The legacy of colonialism is not a simple one, but one of great complexity, with contradictions, both good and bad. Now that quote comes from Chinua Achebe himself, the author that I argued did not see colonialism as entirely negative. So there it was, vindication for my paper. So after years of thinking about that paper and wondering, was I wrong? I ended up being correct. Achebe does not view colonialism as entirely bad. He recognizes that there was some good that came out of it. And he wrote a book in 2012 called There Was a Country, where he said, I'm going to have a long quote here. He said, the British governed their colony of Nigeria with considerable care. There was a very highly competent cadre of government officials imbued with a high level of knowledge of how to run a country. British colonies were, more or less, expertly run. One was not consumed by fear of abduction or armed robbery. One had a great deal of confidence and faith in British institutions. Now, all that has changed. He makes clear that since colonialism ended, faith in the Nigerian government is not there. People don't feel safe. Now, does this mean that the British were a net good in Nigeria? Maybe, maybe not. As Achebe says, it's complicated. Now, Murray, in his book, he also brings up Pakistani Bishop Michael Nazir Ali, who praised the British for outlawing the practice of suti in Pakistan. And this is the custom of burning a widow alive on her husband's funeral pyre. Of course, there are also negative consequences of Britain in that area. But colonialism brought among other things, irrigation to the area for the first time so they could farm and not starve. And, as I said, the end of brutal practices such as sooty, or in Africa, the practice of leaving newborn twins to die in the woods. Now, much of the setup for my main argument today does come from Murray's book, but I talk about it because it reminded me of my own experience with an American school system, which teaches essentially that Western ideas are inherently bad, or that it's bad when Western ideas are exported elsewhere. I don't believe that, and I don't believe that history supports that. Rather, I think that history shows us one thing, and that it's complicated. So, in the West, especially over the past 50 years, there's been a growing movement among scholars and intellectuals to deny that colonialism had any positive aspects. For them, colonialism entirely bad. As Murray points out, British intellectuals now cite to specific atrocities that occurred because of colonialism to argue that it's immoral to acknowledge that any good came out of colonialism. So his best example in the book is the Amritsar Massacre of 1919. Now, as an American, I knew little about this before reading Murray's book. So I guess in 1919, British General Dyer ordered his troops to surround protesters and open fire, and they killed at least 379 people. Dyer was then stripped of his command and lost his pension. Now, I believe it's reasonable to say that there should have been more consequences for him. I believe it's reasonable to call this colonialism at its worst. But it's unreasonable to say that this one event means that we can't recognize any good that came out of colonialism. I think it's unreasonable to say that we cannot weigh the good with the bad and have honest debates about the colonial era. But today, debates get shut down by people who just say colonialism was evil. Just look at the Amritsar Massacre. Okay, but why and how does this apply to the United States? The U.S. was not a colonial power in the same sense as Britain. We didn't participate in the scramble for Africa or take distant Asian lands in the same way that they did. And most of this happened long after the United States was founded, and we chose not to partake. So why are American schools so intent on teaching the evils of colonialism? Why can't it take at least an objective look and weigh the good with the bad? And I believe it's for two intertwined reasons. One, American schools choose to teach students to look at past events through a modern moral lens, so that two, students can more easily view the world through an oppressor versus oppressed system. So, the so-called intellectual class in America, at least those that are widely celebrated, such as Ibram X. Kendi, Ta-Nehisi Coates, and Nicole Hannah-Jones, they're typically race-focused ideologues who view everything from the standard of race. But they have one other thing in common, and that's that they view everything from today's moral standards. So this view of the world definitely did not start with them, but they are among the most prominent, influential figures that push this moral, modern lens on the world today. And after years of outside influence, the university system and now high schools apparently, and the students who go through it also view the world through that same narrow, modern, moral lens. And so when students learn about slavery in America, they don't learn about slavery that existed elsewhere at the time. At the most, we're told that Britain ended slavery 50 years before we did. But we don't learn about slavery in Iran, the Ottoman Empire, Egypt, or Brazil that existed at the time that we outlawed it. Instead, America is painted as if it were the last country to outlaw slavery. When we learn about the horrors done to Native Americans in America, we don't learn about the conquests that the rest of the world engaged in at the time. We don't learn that permanent land borders were rare until after World War II. Battles were continually fought between countries who wanted to claim more land. We don't learn that native tribes used to conquer each other and have their own land disputes. Rather than framing United States expansion as a common thing done in the world at that time, it is framed as if America is uniquely evil by conquering land held by a weaker, less technologically advanced people. Now, it might make sense that a country, especially a Western country, would be harsh on itself when teaching its own history. It's important to recognize that past sins and avoid repeating them. But why must America do the same with a European phenomenon like colonialism in Africa and Asia? And I believe it's because it ties all Western nations into a common sin, the oppression of non-Western peoples. In other words, it teaches students to see the West as oppressors and everyone else as oppressed. Again, the school system ignores that permanent land borders were not the norm in the colonial era. African tribes fought each other, just as Native American tribes did. The world was one where technological advancement determined who conquered whom. Western countries fought Western countries fought non Western countries, and non Western countries fought each other. War and conquest were not unique to the West, they were the way of the world. But by focusing solely on the West, students are taught to see the world as the West versus everyone else, or oppressor versus oppressed, with the West always the oppressor. For some, like the intellectuals I mentioned earlier, this lesson becomes a simple racial narrative. White people are oppressors, people of color are oppressed. That's why Ibram X. Kendi writes books comparing Palestinians to black people. All he sees is that Palestinians are darker than the average Jew, so they must be the oppressed. He'll say that about Palestinians, but ignore conflicts between people of similar pigmentation. He won't talk about Ukraine or Russia, Azerbaijan or Armenia, or India and Pakistan. Instead, he focuses only on conflicts that fit his racialized worldview. While many intellectuals follow Kendi's lead, the American school system has instead instilled what I believe is not necessarily a racialized worldview, but an oppressor versus oppressed, anti-Western view. When race baiters like Kendi can jump in, they steer the conversation towards whites as oppressors, but when they can't, the conflict is either ignored or, if possible, still forced into the oppressor-oppressed narrative. Now, some conflicts are easily categorized as oppressor-oppressed. Like, take the Ukraine-Russia war. Russia is the world power, Ukraine is the weaker nation trying to establish its identity after breaking from the Soviet Union. Russia invaded, totally unprovoked. Here, Russia is clearly the oppressor, Ukraine is the oppressed. But what makes Russia's actions particularly bad compared to past expansionism is that it's happening today under modern morality. We can judge this conflict by today's standards because it is happening today. What we can't do is apply today's standards to actions of the past. For other conflicts that aren't so clear or that don't involve a major power, there's little outcry for the oppressed. Think of Armenia and Azerbaijan, or the land battles in Kosovo, Western Sahara, or the India-Pakistan dispute over Kashmir. There's no massive support for one side or the other. Why? Because these conflicts don't involve Western countries, so they don't fit the narrative that students are taught. They're mostly ignored. The only reason we hear about Kashmir is because both countries have nuclear weapons. Without it, it would be maybe a brief mention in a CNN 5 Things article at most. So this ignorance reveals kind of a hidden patronizing idea within the oppressor-oppressed mindset and the broader school system, and that today's morality only applies to Western or white nations. It's the soft bigotry of low expectations. Non-Western or non-white countries aren't expected to meet the same standards as Western countries. The message is that countries like Azerbaijan, India, and Pakistan are beneath us. They haven't caught up to our great Western minds, so we don't hold them to the same standard. At the same time, this reveals a deep hypocrisy. Non-Western nations aren't judged by today's standards, but we retroactively apply those standards to Western countries, even when those standards did not exist at the time. The two ideas, that non-Westerners should not be judged by today's moral standards, but that we should apply today's moral standards retroactively to past actions by Western countries, cannot coexist. The West's selective application of moral judgment not only distorts our understanding of history and current events, but also portrays a patronizing view of the rest of the world, one that excuses others from moral responsibility while holding ourselves to impossible standards. Now, today, it's common to hear claims that students are being taught to be anti-white or anti-Western in schools. And look, no school teaches this explicitly, but I believe that my experience illustrates how subtle, prevailing narratives can shape classroom perspectives. The books we read and the discussions we have often guide us toward a single interpretation of the world. But the classroom should be a place for open-minded debate. In my experience, however, assignments that in general are intended to encourage discussion often reveal how subtle cues from the professor can shape classroom consensus, making it difficult for other viewpoints to be fairly considered, both among students and in the grading process. Complex issues in schools should not be boiled down to one narrative. Teach the complexities of everything, from the evils of colonialism to the good it brought, from the horrors of slavery to the realities of the world at the time. If we want to apply moral standards worldwide, let's do it evenly and only to the modern day. The greatness that the West has brought to the world, Freedom, unlike anything the world has ever seen before, cannot be sustained if the West continues to cast itself as the world's great evil.